Welcome to the Santa Cruz Coffee Break. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcast, please follow, hit the like button, or any subscribes. It really helps us with the algorithms. Santa Cruz Coffee Break is produced by the Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum. All opinions are those of the speakers. We invite you to join us on the Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum at SCGCPF for more fun. Now, let's get on with this installment of Santa Cruz Coffee Break.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the 76th podcast of the Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum. And today, it can't get any better than this. We have Joe Glaser. Joe is, if you don't know, Joe is probably the most in-demand repairman in Nashville. Would that be correct, sir?
No, I'd never say something like that, but you said
it. You're pretty busy, a pretty busy guy. Joe started as a builder. Actually, started as you started in high tech Silicon Valley.
Yeah,
making laser magnets or something. What was that?
I worked for a company that made focusing magnets for particle beam accelerators.
Hello.
And it was a very interesting experience in that I learned a lot about a number of different parts of manufacturing. I went to college in the Bay Area. I went to Stanford University. I was not an effective student, but I went there. I always tell people I learned what smart really is, and I learned the difference between studying and screwing around. I did mostly the second, the latter. Anyway, I worked at I was an English major, but I had studied a certain amount of mechanical engineering, somewhat driven by the fact that I played pedal steel and needed to have some access to a machine shop, believe it or not, to work on my steel. And in my freshman year in college, I saw somewhere in a listing that there was a introduction to mechanical engineering had a lab component. You had to work in the machine shop and make stuff. So I took that. I think that looking back on it, I think that was my driver. If it wasn't, I've turned it into that in retrospect. And so I took some mechanical engineering stuff. I found I was very interested in. When I was an English major, I wrote fiction, and that very much came naturally to me. At a certain point, when I started to be able to sell the stuff I was writing, I realized that it was not what you call a living. It was never going to be a living, and I didn't want to teach. I was married to this woman that was a painter. And she was a great painter, but she also was not going to earn enough of a substantial living. So at that point, I just went and got a job, and it was at this place. I got exposed to the machine shop there, the painting, drafting, and eventually the engineering department. So I got a good background out of it.
Wow, that firsthand knowledge is great. Yeah, I saw the pedal steel reference to your early time is and of course that would be you would need a mechanical engineering degree to keep one running.
Well, particularly in the Bay Area. I mean, there might have been 4 people who played steel in the Bay Area, maybe a few more, but not very many. And because I was learning from records, and which involves slowing records down, trying to figure out what people were doing with this instrument, which, in case anybody doesn't know, they're 2 necks with 10 strings on them, and then a number of foot pedals and knee levers that do pitch bending. Pretty complicated, but also because I didn't learn in a conventional way, I kind of made up my own. I worked around pretty typical tuning at the time, but I made up my own knee lever pitch bend choices. And ironically, some of them have come to be very, very standard stuff that Paul Franklin uses today. Of all the things I claim to have gotten to before, anybody. I'm aware of the fact that somebody else got there before I did. But as far as with all these things through my career, a lot of it I discovered on my own, which is naivete, but also I really put effort into introducing people to things, many of which became industry standards, or in the case of the steel, at least for the area where I was playing, it became kind of the a particular change everybody used. And early on, I didn't really think, I didn't have the standing to act like it was any big deal. But and some of the early stuff, like I'm kind of originated the sound hole volume control. Nobody was using a sound hole volume control. We used it out of convenience and pitched it at, to Larry Fishman and to Lloyd Baggs, who had adopted it. It never occurred to me to try to make something out of that. And so a lot of the stuff early on that I did with the steel or any of those things were I was already thinking ahead of what everybody else was doing. And one of the beautiful things of being in the middle of nowhere, which is what Palo Alto was to steel playing, was that it left me open-minded enough to think about what would really be cool instead of what was everybody already doing.
It's obvious with the development of the bender and things like that. I've seen Marty Stewart's Clarence's bender, and it's like the guitar is like this thick or something. I mean, it's what, and it's a whole bunch of different stuff in the back than the simplicity of what you do. That's just built into the guitar.
Well, we should explain to the audience what the bender is you're referring to. It's a string bender for I guess electric and acoustic instruments. I'm only familiar with it on acoustic, which I think is pretty damn wild.
It's a strap activated mechanism that stretches one or more strings up a half step or a whole step. Most people, or at least originally Clarence White, who was playing with the Byrds and doing studio work in LA, used it on the B string to go up a whole step. He did also have a second. His guitar was set up with some Fender steel guitar parts, which would allow different other strings to be pulled. I don't know how much they experimented with this because I wasn't in that scene at the time. But it's a regular guitar body, and then they put another back cavity on it that doubles its thickness. It's fairly crudely made, but by today's standards. But I get to work on that guitar, and I'm totally enamored with being able to peer back into history and see what incredible genius stuff that Clarence and Gene Parsons were doing, and obviously later Dave Evans and all the other people who innovated on this, what they were doing with what they had around.
No machine shop.
Well, they did. Gene Parsons was a machinist, but and most machinists, that meant being able to work on your car. But I came at it from a different direction, in that I had worked in an industry where it was more focused on micro machining or doing stuff economically because you didn't have room. You just didn't have room to do a lot of stuff. And the things that I mean, my first bender, which I found recently, is crude. It was done with a hammer and a hacksaw or something. I mean, it's crude. But as I stayed at it and refined it, I was looking more at things like if you took apart a tape machine, what were the cams and stuff like that, and then eventually when Apple phones and all these things came out, every time there was a new version of something, it was hipper, smaller, cooler. It started to have a beautiful design element, and so I've just always thought about that. I've always thought about that in making stuff, is not only how do you make it small, the fewest parts, very dependable, and smooth. I mean, we focused a lot on trying to make the smoothest bender possible, but also when somebody picks it up and looks at it, what's their reaction going to be? And this it's what I would want as a consumer. So I very much try to put that into the design. Santa Cruz, this is exactly what Richard does. I mean, I've learned from all these guys, by the way. I've learned from all my heroes. And one of the characteristics of Richard Hoover or Bill Collings or some of the, John Suhr, Paul Smith, Paul Reed Smith, some of the really gifted designers is that they're building something that people want to have. And it's not by accident. Sure, they're building for themselves and they build something that they would like to have, but it's very much about thinking, what is the customer, what's going to make a customer happy, not just what makes me happy, what makes somebody else happy.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's really great, and that is a trait of Richard's. Really, between him and the customer, that is a trait of his, that he just wants to see him. He wants them to be happy, so they can spread that.
Mm-hmm.
That they can then take this instrument, this creation, whatever it is, and go become one with it and share
Mm-hmm.
it. And that's really really interesting. I would spend 3 hours asking you about benders, but I think we should I think we should probably move on to the PLEK machine, and this is your baby.
Somewhat.
It's absolutely brilliant.
Well, I've been part of the team since about 2000. I sort of stumbled on it after being contacted by the original guys, Gerrit Anke and Michel Dubac, and I think it was I forget who it was who contacted me from overseas about this machine they had. I basically blew them off at first because the brochures looked kind of fanciful, and I didn't think they had much of an understanding of what something had to do to work on a guitar. I blew them off, and they did bring this machine. They'd made 10 of them, and they the German government sponsors innovation and technology, so they made some of them. They brought them over to the U.S. I saw that they brought it to my shop to set it up for a summer NAMM show because they needed a place to set it up and test it. And I was struck immediately, not so much by what it did, but by what it could do, what it was headed to do. And coming out of a technology frame of mind, which is what the Bay Area was, I was thinking about not so much the fact that it dressed frets. I mean, here's a machine that in theory scans a guitar strung to pitch, looks at what's going on with the fingerboard and lets you impose a perfect or as good as nice as possible of a fret plane, meaning the surface of the frets, on the existing neck, so that when a player plays it plays the best it can, because the surface is not artistically but scientifically and artistically laid out to play as well as it possibly can. I saw the scanning part as being the big breakthrough, and when the price was tremendous, it was $80,000 in 2000. This is like $300,000 today or more, maybe not, but something like that. And but I saw the scanning capability. I saw that we were doing good fretwork, but not as good of fretwork as I would have liked. And so I saw it as a doorway to improving what we did. I blind tested my customers so that I had their feedback. I got the guys from Germany to promise me that if I let them store the machine here, because they didn't sell it at the Summer NAMM show, that I could use it. And that I blind tested, I think, 80 of my customers who didn't know anything about it. I just told them, listen, I'm going to do something with your frets. I'm going to do this thing. And because they trusted me, I did it, and one by one they'd come back to me and go, this something is really great about this guitar that wasn't great before. And after I heard that a bunch of times, and coming from a background of being skeptical about anything that you can't prove, I went ahead and went to the bank and borrowed the money and bought it. That meant that for it to really become part of what we do and part of what the rest of the world does, it needed to be brought up to a certain speed standard, and it needed a simplicity of user interface. It needed a speed that was probably 5 times as fast as it was, and it also needed to be able to capture and retain data, which it didn't. It had scanning data, but it had no customer information, no instrument information saved. And so I worked with them. I got involved early on because of that, and tried to make the point that the PLEK could be much faster, would need to be much faster, and that it was probably as much a data play as it was a tool. And so that's where I came in. That's more or less what my role's been. Partly engineering, but it's actually my role with them is somewhat engineering, because I've been involved in the innovation of the model since 2000. Partly business development, because I've done all the biz dev with Santa Cruz, for instance, and then partly looking at the big picture of how does this work and how does this fit into the world, and at what point is the information going to be as important or more important than the actual work.
That's part of what I'm really intrigued with. Is I guess people believe that the PLEK machine dropped onto the planet fully formed and as a unit doing all these wonderful things, but really what happened is you and other people helped develop what that machine has become. Can you kind of tell us about the evolution of what you originally started with and where you're at now?
Well, so to be clear, even the way it was when I first saw it, and I'm not trying to take a lot of credit for this, but I think that we were all lucky to meet each other. But as it started, it scanned very accurately. It scanned with this plus or minus a couple thousandths of a millimeter. And for people who've managed to fight off the metric system, a millimeter is about the size of an A string on an acoustic guitar, or it's about the height of a fret. And so it's scanning this fret plane with it, to a repeatable accuracy of a couple thousandths of that. And the reason accuracy matters is that a string will buzz at average action. A string will buzz noticeably under typical attack if there's a high and low differentiation in the frets of about 20 thousandths of a millimeter, 16 thousandths of a millimeter, 12 thousandths, somewhere around in there. And the lower the action, the more you'll hear that. And so this is like a third of a thousandth of an inch or a quarter of a thousandth of an inch. And it really matters because people hear it. And so all that accuracy was already in there, in the measuring capability of it. I tell people the customer, when we were talking before we went live about customer service, how important it is. Customer service is critical. And the way I look at it is that it's all about making the players happy. You make the players happy, that's great. But to make a player happy with frets, you have to make the string happy. You make the string happy, you make the player happy, you make me happy, you make my company happy, or you make Richard Hoover happy, you make Santa Cruz happy. So what does it take to make a string play the best it can? Well, when a string plays, as you use it, it creates kind of an elliptical shape, like a jump rope. And the harder you pick it, the greater that the amplitude of that wave is. And while you can set a guitar up any way you want in this world, and great music has been made on guitars with all kinds of setups. And in fact, some of the greatest music ever made was not made on great guitars. And some of the stuff we'll remember 400 years from now was made on instruments that the average guy today would not play if they bought it at a store, they would say this needs major setup. These guys felt lucky to get these guitars. They played them, they learned to play around the problems, and they made great music because they were great artists. But a string, when you hit it as hard as you're going to hit it, your attack, for your maximum attack for whoever you are, you have to have the action high enough so that string doesn't bang into the frets. And that string shape, as I said, changes depending on how hard you plan to hit. If you plan to hit hard, there's more of a curve. And so the neck has to have this curve built into the fret plane. And this is what the PLEK does. Not only executes really accurately, but also calculates really accurately. One of the interesting things in the beginning, I had to dig back through all that math that I paid little attention to in college, and calculus and analytic geometry to try to prove to myself that the PLEK algorithm was correct. But what happened after that was that we scanned thousands and thousands of guitars that great builders made, that people loved, that guys would come into my shop weeping, "This thing is so great. This is the best playing guitar ever." And we would go scan this immediately, and the same shape turned up over and over and over again, the same contour. And it turns out that because it's physics, it's not mojo. Everybody thought they had their touch. Oh, I dress frets differently than anybody else. Anybody who was any good was doing the same thing. They were always doing the same thing. They either executed it well or not as well as they thought. And that's really these non-believers who are out there who go, PLEK, I can do that better. They probably can't. But if they are doing it as well, they're doing the exact same thing. They're creating the same shape. And we see this every now and then. Some of these guys some people are quite good by hand.
Yeah. Well, now the original PLEK machine, didn't it mostly work on creating just a single flat plane of the fretboard, or did they already have that curve and all that stuff developed at that stage? I was under the impression that whole algorithm has been refined over the last 20 plus years.
Some of it has. There are things that have changed, but Gerd Anke, who originated this, interestingly enough, in Berlin, he had a machine in the basement of this 5-story walk-up he lived in, or lives in, and this machine was made out of bicycle and washing machine parts, I think. And it had a file just the way you would ordinarily file frets. The file mechanically went up and down, and then he'd take this guitar and he'd run up 5 flights of stairs to where he had the measuring part with the computer, and he would measure it, and then he would look at what he wanted to do, and he'd run downstairs again, and it would take a day or days to do this.
Wow.
What they figured out fairly quickly, what he and Thomas, his cousin, who's still the programmer, figured out was that because it's physics based, if you figure out what a string does and what the string does open and the first fret and the second fret and the fourth fret, etc., if you figure out what that does, then imposing that shape into the fret dress you plan to do is not that complicated. It's the measurement and execution that are really, really complicated, and that's why there aren't 18 million different knockoffs of a PLEK machine out there, because the analysis of the software analysis is very, very complicated, and to measure accurately and cut accurately is way harder than people think it might be.
Yeah, I can't imagine. One thing I noticed was intonation, because, and Richard said this to me at one point. He said, when you push the string down at the first or second fret, the string's a different length than it is at the 12th fret if you play up there. And the fact that the PLEK can take that information and do it at 10 millionth of an inch or something like that. Crazy.
Well, we don't brag about the fact that it's going to make guitars sound better, because that just sounds like hocus pocus, because it's really just dressing the frets. But if you dress the frets with a tool that gets the shape of every fret the same as every other fret, then the string's going to sound the same coming off of each fret as it does the next fret. And so people do comment after they get a PLEK dress that they think their guitar sounds better. It sounds better because of that, and also because it's not rattling here or there, just these micro rattles. Now, to be really clear about this, so let me answer your question. The first PLEK, the guitar laid down in it. It's why we call the thing that holds the guitar a cradle, because it's sort of laid down in it, and it measured, and then it sanded the frets. For the first 3 or 4 years, it sanded the frets with this little abrasive wheel. We then, in order to speed it up, after I got involved and we had these conversations about what would a company need to be able to use a PLEK, and what was the time, we decided it was, I told them that the cycle time in the Pacific Rim factories was 10 minutes to dress frets, and or less, and they needed to shoot for that, from coming in from an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and 40 minutes, what the original PLEK Basic did. And so sanding the frets the way they were doing wasn't going to make it happen. So that's when we went to the cutter that you see today, which is a carbide cutter. But the thing about the guitars is that they're still made out of wood no matter what. And some pieces of wood speak better than other pieces of wood. There's a reason Brazilian rosewood or nice mahogany is used on guitars, and instead of clay or canvas or something that doesn't resonate and reflect. And so the quality of a body and a neck have something to do with why some guitars sound better than others. And so we do run into guitars that are made with, in particular, soft necks. If instruments are made with soft necks and don't have some sort of carbon fiber rigidity built into them, they won't sound as good, and they also will tend to rattle more when you play, no matter how nice the frets are, because the string's going like this, and the neck turns out to start to be vibrating more. The softer it is, the more tendency it has to have an exaggerated vibration, and that creates rattling. And so we're always very careful to not promise things about wood that you can't promise. You can promise that the frets will be precisely level, and it'll be the curve that the string wants to see, and the amount of fall away above the 12th fret will be what it wants to see. But you can't promise that a guitar is going to sound good, or that you can't. And that's what all builders face.
Yeah. But the machine has developed over time. It now does more than just frets, right? It's nut slots and mm-hmm. saddles and I mean, I don't even know what the full range capabilities of the machine are now. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it could glue the fretboard down and build the whole neck.
It could have. I mean, we do have to make decisions about that. But yeah, it originally started just doing frets, and then we added nut slot cutting, then nut top shaping, fret slot cutting. So a builder who doesn't have any other way to really accurately cut fret slots can do it in place on the instrument. They can do it. They can pocket the frets so that you don't see the fret ends. It's like a wood binding. It very importantly, it will do fingerboard planing, so it will put any radius, any kind of complex radius, a compound radius, a complex compound radius that say starts at the nut at let's just say 8 inches, and by the time that you're at the 12th fret, you're at 10, and then by the time you're at the end, it's 14, and it blends all that. So you can do any of that. One of the things that while I was the first guy who was really Charlie Chandler in London also was an early professional user. I was probably the most vocal, belly aching guy when I got it. It needs to do this, it needs to do that. But when Gary Brower in San Francisco bought one, he and I started leaning on the guys at PLEK, telling them that what was needed in the real world. For instance, to be able to have the curve that, if this is the nut, the curve that starts at the nut and goes toward the saddle by the time you get to the 12th or 14th fret, that needs to not continue up in a curve, but to what we call fall away or drop. And that was a months long conversation trying to get that to be recognized as a necessary part of making an ideal fret plane. And it was Gary was because it was not just me mouthing off from sitting on a hay bale in Nashville, Tennessee, but now there's this guy in San Francisco who also wanted the same thing. And so the PLEK team started to pay attention to this, and they began to appreciate the fact that Americans could bring something to the table that was valuable, even though we didn't necessarily design this thing from the ground up in the first place. And that concept of different cultural input, because of the different way people play, and what a fingerboard for a shredder needs to be is really different than what a person just playing first position acoustic. So that feedback loop was important. I'm sure it was frustrating. At one point, I needed something else. We needed something else. I think it was the data part or something. And the guys at PLEK said, okay, after this, development is done. We'll do this one more thing and development is done. And I told them, I said, listen, development is never done. And that's turned out to be the case because we now can work with multi-scale, fan fret systems. Like you said, Dad, we can do saddles and nuts and some inlay and put the pinholes into a bridge, and whatever makes sense to the most users, we are working on.
Wow. It's an amazing piece of technology. Do you still have your original one salted away in the basement somewhere, or for historical purposes?
I don't have my original PLEK Basic because I didn't have room for it, and somebody else came and bought it. But I do have the first PLEK Pro, which is there was no PLEK station. You guys have a PLEK station. I think you do. Maybe you have PLEK Pros. And in any case, it's something that would no longer be appropriate for a shop like mine. But we didn't designate that at the time. We just built the next, this next evolution of it. Mine's put together out of 3 different machines because we updated different parts. It's twice as big as a normal PLEK, but we can't get it out of the room. And it continues to work. I mean, we update it mechanically and we updated the software regularly, so it doesn't matter. And I kind of like the fact that it's this old road warrior of a machine. We've got 50 or 60,000 guitars and the data on 50 or 60,000 guitars in the history of that machine.
That's amazing. Simply amazing. I can't believe. I mean, I remember the first time I played a guitar that came out. It sounded different.
Mm-hmm.
I had never really thought about all those little micro buzzes and stuff like that
Mm-hmm.
that are there, but
Mm-hmm.
they're there. They're real.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an amazing thing.
How many machines do you think are out there in the world now?
Probably about 150 of them, somewhere around in there. Santa Cruz did really good fretwork before they got a PLEK. We just have to be fair about this. Collings did really good fretwork. Bill Collings used to call me up really pissed off. He'd go, God damn it, I've got this guitar, it has a problem, and I don't know where it is. And I go, well, can I do anything? He goes, I don't want one of those PLEK machines, but God damn it, can I send this thing to you? And he'd send, this happened 4 or 5 times. He'd send me a guitar, I'd scan it, I'd see what the problem was. Be small. I'd fix it, I'd send it back to him, and he'd go, and I'd send him a scan, which we don't ordinarily share with people because you have to really understand a lot to have any idea what you're looking at. But I'd send him, and he'd go, I knew that, or he'd kind of do that and go, well, listen, you guys do great fretwork. You don't need it. And eventually, when he bought one, I said, well, why? You guys do great fretwork. It's like mostly as good as a PLEK, most of the time. And he said, well, that's the difference. He said, I want to know when we're done that the stuff is as good as it can possibly be. And I said, well, what all are you going to do with it? And he said, I don't know. I'm going to buy it, and then I'm going to figure out what we're going to do. And I've lived by that statement affected me tremendously. And in the ensuing 12 years, it's been my attitude toward technology is if somebody can find something that a piece of technology can do that you can't otherwise do, if you have it on hand, you're going to figure out how to optimize it and how to utilize it. But it really still comes down to two facts. One is Santa Cruz was doing very nice fretwork. Was it PLEK quality? Would the PLEK machine have said, in the final report on a guitar, PLEK quality achieved? Maybe 10% of the time, and the other percent of the time, not quite. But it wasn't Santa Cruz stuff, for instance, and Collings, and I mean, you can name a few of these people who really were as good as people would like to think. They weren't always there, and it's that little percentage of time of knowing that you're not where you want to be, and that you're doing it with your wrist and your elbow, and you're still those two things: the fact that you're wearing out human beings, you're not exactly where you want to be, and you don't know if you're where you want to be. Confidence, doing this is what people do. They go, I'm a master. And why? Because I know I am. Well, that's not good enough. Well, because Freddie Jones told me I am. And who's he? Well, he's this guy. He's one of my main customers. It's like, okay, that's science. That proves it. The fact is we all want to feel good like this. But if you can't see something and you can't see why, then it's just one opinion against another. And that's the way the whole guitar business has been, somewhat still is, but has been for years and years and years. How should a truss rod be? What is the best kind of truss rod? Should a neck be straight? Should it have some relief? What kind of fingerboard radius? We had these idiotically flat fingerboard radiuses, 10 to 14 inches, 11 to 14 inches. It's not comfortable, but people decided that if like a 8-inch compound radius felt good, let's just jack it up to 11. That's got to feel better. And they didn't really think about the fact that it's based on a certain kind of math, which is, first of all, what feels good to your left hand in the first position, and then flatten it out at the rate that the neck gets wider. Because a neck, for instance, is part of a cone. It's not a cylinder. A neck is part of a cone. And the strings get further apart, and at the rate they get further apart, it would actually make if the neck went on around the whole way, it would be a cone. So the math is all there. It's just that people have kind of defiantly lived in their mother's basement and built these things and not checked with anybody else, and just made a lot of noise about how they solved all the problems. And it's only been in the last 10, 15 years that all these builders sharing stuff and manufacturers sharing stuff have led to much, much better guitars and a beginning of real information that is worth teaching, that it's somewhat true, it's worth teaching. Brian Gallup says there's 30 ways to do things. 27 of them are wrong, but there are 3 of them that are right. There are 3 different ways of doing everything, and there's not just one way. And I totally agree with him. And the fact is that you don't have to do one way, but you ought to avoid doing those 27 things that really aren't even right.
Yeah, yeah. The thing that amazes me about the PLEK is I remember when I was a much younger person, that if you went to get a guitar set up, they'd get it really as good as they could, and you'd play it and you'd say, could it come down a little bit more? And they'd be like, well, I don't know. I'm afraid if I take it down a little bit more, you're going to start getting some buzzes. And it's like, well, I don't know. I think it's worth a try. Okay, we'll try taking it down a little bit more, and eventually you get to a point where it's like, oh shit, I wish I hadn't taken that last little bit off. That's what the PLEK eliminates, is there's no guessing. There's no assuming that this or that is going to work, or how far can you go, or whatever. It's all measurements and science. And
well, as you guys know, I think we make a shop management software called ShopFlow, and Santa Cruz uses it. By the way, we make a small builders version that you guys use. Thank you. But one thing that we do is we really look at how does a person play? Because to your point, there is such a thing as too low for a given player. And it's very important to work with somebody to know how they actually play, because even for them, there's a point where if you look at how they play and you look where that threshold of buzzing is, that you can predict, and then you can work around their target action and really get it to where when it only rattles when they exceed their threshold of attack. You know, it's like attack drives action. The harder you hit, the higher the action needs to be, and then the action determines the relief and all the rest of this stuff. I think record keeping has come along with the PLEK in the sense that in the 70s, like you were talking about, because I'm from that generation, people put the neck as straight as they could, and they didn't understand how high the nut needed to be. You know, if a nut's too high, it's going to play really stiff in the first position. It's going to be out of tune because you're stretching the strings over the nut. Nobody understood this stuff. If they left the nut too high, they had to bring the saddle down to make the action in the middle of the neck feel like they wanted. It was just chaos. Now we understand this stuff. Many shops measure this stuff very carefully. They know most shops know how to get a nut to a height, because it's a 0 fret. You don't treat the nut like something other than one more fret. But people know how to do this. Guitars are much better because of that general body of data, and the PLEK is part of that. It's not the cause of it, but it's been part of it. And it's one way, if you're in control at all, it's one way to get into very precise control.
I first of all, I think we've probably taken up enough of your time here, and I really want to thank you for it. I believe that we are living in the golden age of guitars right now. You know, the things that are being made are fantastic.
Can we talk about Richard Hoover?
Yes.
Yeah. Richard, who I met, you know, I was like a stammering idiot at walking around these trade shows with all these guys who were on my Mount Rushmore of builders and players. I mean, it was a big Mount Rushmore, but Richard was certainly there because of the quality of stuff that he did and the care that he put into it, and that expression of the fact that the more you give away, the more you receive, which sounds like hocus pocus, but it's true, and it works in instruments. I met Richard, I think, at a NAMM show early on, or at an Asia symposium, and he was nice to me. He didn't know I didn't have any standing. I didn't know. I mean, maybe I'd worked on some instruments for some of the Santa Cruz artists, but you know, I just was another guy. Richard was nice to me. He was open-minded, and he listened. And I think Richard is an example of the fundamentally most important type of company owner and new company owner, in that he was his own inspiration. He was his own quality standard, but he listened to everybody, and he applied anything that seemed like it, or he at least investigated anything that seemed like it was a good idea. He didn't just do old school. He wasn't just like, oh, that's not what I'm already doing. And so Richard was fundamentally important in that early on. I got to meet him when he started getting interested in the PLEK. By the way, I did the PLEK business development because having one of the only 10 machines or whatever wasn't a good plan, because if they ever needed a problem and there wasn't a successful company behind it, there would never be support. So as soon as I got my PLEK, I went and started to spread the word, not only because it made the whole industry better to get a better measuring and execution program, but also information was important. Richard was very early on in taking it seriously and saying, well, what would this do for us? What do you already know about the work we're doing? And so the kind of mind that Richard has influenced me tremendously. And there's a little bit, his generosity, you know, I don't have much, I'm not much of a petri dish for generosity and other things that nice human beings have. But nonetheless, there's a little bit of it growing in there. And it's because of a few people. And he's primary in that group of small people who have helped the whole industry change, which has helped PLEK, which is what we've been primarily talking about.
Well, we will agree with you 100% that Richard is one of the most giving and caring people that I've ever met in the music industry.
Yeah. Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
I mean, fascinating and really important stuff. And, you know, the more you give, the more you get.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, if anybody watching this ever has questions or wants to call us up, you know, the shop is listed, it's Glaser Instruments. And if they want to call me and tell me about how this is true or this isn't true, I'm always available to explain anything that could be explained. And also I'm always available to learn something new, and I learn something new every day. So I very much appreciate this.
Yeah, we'll put your link. We'll put a link up in the post and stuff like that. So we, you know, can't thank you enough for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
If anyone wants to buy a PLEK machine for their home shop, should they call you?
It's been done. There's some collectors who have these, but if somebody's interested, obviously, I'll put them in touch with. I'll give them what I do is I explain how, if you had one, what you would do with it. I'm kind of an implementation guy. The business guys are, it's Michel Dubac, who's in Berlin, who's the CEO. He's been in the company since the very beginning. He and Gerrit Anke and I've kind of been and Thomas, the developer, have been really there since it turned into a company. And, but yeah, if somebody's interested, they can always contact me and I'll help them any way we can.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We'll get you out of here and let you get back to work.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys.
We hope you enjoyed this installment of the Santa Cruz Coffee Break. For more music-related fun, please join the Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum at SCGCPF or santacruzguitarplayers.com. If you have any questions or possible podcast topics, please contact us. If you have a product or service that you feel would be of value to our listeners, please consider adding your support and keeping the coffee pot on. Contact us for more information. We ask that you hit the like, follow, bell, or bookmark buttons so we can keep you informed of upcoming podcast episodes. We hope you enjoyed Santa Cruz Coffee Break. Now it's time to go play your guitar.